please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Wayne Townsend.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for coming. How many GI experiences do we have here? Guys, how are you? You and me?
You and me.
Well, we can say lots of things and maybe they won't check on us, do you suppose? Well, they tell me that Benjamin Franklin was given credit for the wisdom that I'm about to relate to you. When he said, "For the want of a nail, a shoe was lost. For the want of a shoe, a horse was lost. For the want of a horse, a warrior was lost. For the want of a warrior, a battle was lost. For the want of a battle, a kingdom was lost. All for the want of a horseshoe nail." And there have been some things happened in recent years that we can relate to that. Some things became more important than what they were at the time, and some things went the other way. But I've heard my dad recite that to me probably 10,000 times when I did not measure up to what he thought his expectations should be. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about a place called Purdue, or perhaps I should say an idea called Purdue. First, let me tell you about Mom and Dad. They only went to the 8th grade. In the 1880s, that was the normal. But people in that day and age, that was a common school education, and that's what they did, and they did not go to high school. But they were two of the wisest people I've ever known in my life. They were married in the early 1900s, raised a family, lived to see all their kids go to Purdue with Purdue degrees. I had a sibling here of 1930 to 1939. My sister Vida lived in the first women's residence hall, opened in 1934. A fellow resident was named Amelia Earhart. My sister Mary graduated in the last class, graduating in Lambert Fieldhouse in 1939. My older brothers were members of the same college fraternity, and at age 8, 10, or 12, I was turned loose for days at a time in that fraternity house. I learned a lot of things Mother wished I had never learned. Eliot was president. He was an icon. President from 22 to 45. In the 1930s, there was a radio show called Town Meeting Tonight. At our house, it was required listening. Dad wanted you to know what was going on in the world and be prepared to deal with it and prove it if you could. But once a week, I believe it originated in Philadelphia, they discussed some current affair. And one evening, Eliot shared the forum with an Ivy League president. And believe it or not, this was the topic that evening. What is a proper place for athletics on today's college campus? Can you imagine, 75 years ago, they were talking about this, and probably much more debatable today than what it was then. Anyway, the Ivy League president had come out swinging. And what he said was that he understood that when a student enrolled in a college in Indiana, the Hoosier State, the first question he asked was not, where is the library, but who's your coach? And Eliot's rejoinder was, at Purdue, the most likely place to find the coach would be at the library. I didn't come along till 9 years after my nearest sister. I was an afterthought. And late in life, a relative led me aside and told me about the birds and the bees and what happened. How many fishermen do we have here? Oh gosh, all you people go fishing? You know what? I'm envious. I didn't know what people did when they went fishing. What my relative told me was that the first week in August in 1925, Dad and Mother went fishing at Douglas Lake in northern Michigan. And three of us came home. And you know what? Dad, or Mother never went fishing with Dad again. That was the last time she ever went fishing with him, but she came home pregnant from that fishing trip to Douglas Lake. And I am grateful that they did that because I might not be here otherwise. I can't come in this room, guys, without thinking what went on here 65 years ago. Just saw on one level at that time. In this room, I have sat in lectures with Lowell Hardin, Don Parlberg, Earl Butts. I don't think Dick Coles ever had a class in him in this room, but we did down the hallway and across the street. But there's so many stories to be told about what happened here, then I have to share one with you. And one came from 1948. Tom Dewey, the governor of New York, was running against Harry Truman for president. And all fall, Earl had told us about what Tom Dewey was going to do when he got to be president. This would change, and that would change, and something else would change. These are Dewey's things that he's going to do when he gets to be president. Well, we didn't know until 10 o'clock Wednesday morning who had won that election. I didn't go to bed. I was up with those all-nighters I pulled when I was in college. And when Earl came in that day, this was all one level, came down this side of the room, up to the front of the room. They booed Earl until they rattled the windows. You have never heard such a commotion in all your life. And he spent about the most of the class eating probably 50 pounds of crow before the day was over. He gets up in front of the class and he says, "Fellow Democrats." Every Wednesday morning, or every Wednesday afternoon, prior to that Wednesday, we had a 20-question true-false test. And somewhere along the way, Earl had gotten feedback that some of his graduate students were saying he did not have to study for his course. And Earl was bent out of shape. Well, I should put it differently. Earl was pissed, if you want the truth. And that day, there were 2 questions on the test. Question 1 was, you were to have read chapter 5 in such and such a reference book at the library. And please outline the arguments used by the author and tell whether or not you agree or disagree with the author's conclusions. Second question was outline chapter 6. Same thing. Now he said if you didn't read your assignment and say so, you'll get 50 points. If you guess and guess wrong, you could get 0. I sat there for 10 minutes trying to figure out what Earl Butts would have done had he been a student in that start of a class. And the only thing I could think of to put on the paper was, for any professor to pull a test like this on the day after the election would leave little doubt about the circumstances surrounding his birth. And I got the paper back and had 50 points on it. It says, why not? I was born a Democrat too. I'll give you 50 points for this. Well, considering what I might say about the horseshoe nails and empires, let me talk about 2 acts of Congress, 80 years apart, and some of you are much better prepared to talk about this than I would be. However, first, the Morrill Act of 1862 and the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. Probably two of the most sweeping changes we've ever seen in college learning. In the 18th century, most of the learning was for the moneyed aristocracy. Not the best students, but those who had the most money. Beginning in the about 1800, there had begun to be some sort of desire to have instruction for agricultural and mechanic arts. In 1830, there was a committee formed for the Board of Agriculture in Indiana with expressed desire to have education as its main purpose. It didn't happen. And in 1852, there was a resolution by asking the state university at that time, in this case Indiana, to provide for agricultural and mechanic arts instruction. They put it on paper. No appropriation. Didn't happen. Now think about this for a moment. Here was a horseshoe nail. In Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, they refer to the university as the Ohio State University. Had this happened at that time, there might not have been a Purdue. You'd have the Indiana State University instead. About the time that this happened, Morrow was active with his Morrow Act of 1858 to begin with. Buchanan vetoed it, and in 62, of course, it was passed. Morrow's original intention, as I understand it, was to have something like West Point or Annapolis pertaining to agriculture and mechanic arts. Long after that, they decided to have one in each state. But you have to wonder if Morrow were alive today, if he could see what's happened, if he could believe what all has transpired, the work he was done in 1862. The Civil War interfered, of course, with a lot of people like it did, like World War II did. And attempting to bring about an institution here in Indiana, there's a lot of wrangling. The four places they talked about were Indianapolis, Bloomington, Greenfield, and Tippecanoe County. And it ended up here because of an entrepreneur named John Purdue, who gave money and land for the establishment of the university, and part of that deal was that he was to be a part of it forever. A guy by the name of Jacob Johnstein from Lafayette had a lot to do with making sure that it ended up here. Incidentally, Sheila Claytor was not a part of that legislature at that time. After a considerable number of years of wrangling and decision-making and struggles, September '84, they opened the university here with 6 faculty, 39 students. 8 females were denied admission because they were the wrong gender in that day. I think that's changed by now. In 1944, Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act with little or no comment or notice. They thought it would be minimal. This was to reward those who served the country in World War II. The consensus was that it really wouldn't make a lot of difference. The genesis was the bonus that was passed in 1924, rewarding the World War I vets. They passed the bonus for a $1,500 stipend for the vets. They didn't get it. And what was written wasn't acceptable. With the depression on the scene and people very concerned about what's going to happen tomorrow, the veterans marched on Washington in '32, only be turned down. Their camp was burned by one General Douglas MacArthur, and they went home unhappy. So all of this is in the background of the 44 Act. It passed easily, not much debate, good bipartisan support, because members of Congress had this still fresh in their minds. No one really envisioned the impact of all this, but things changed in a hurry by the fall of 1946. And universities across the nation were caught up with this. Had people coming home from military service, tempered by the Depression, matured with the war. The guys wanted to get married, they wanted to go to school, they wanted to have a job. They projected 600,000, 88,000 enrolled in 45, 1,000,000 in 46, and 2,200 in the fall of 47. Purdue's experience was much like the rest. Hovde had just become president. He went from something like 7,000 to 14,000, 11,000 in 46, and 15,000 nearly in 47. One of Hovde's first hires was Nelson Parkhurst. And Nelson Parkhurst at that time was assistant director of admissions. And they asked Nelson to come up with an estimate for 1946. He projected 11,500. They told him he was out of his mind. 11,472 were enrolled. And that prompted Vice President Hakama to say to Nelson, "Young man, you're pretty good, but I want you to know that prophets die early." Well, Nelson lived to be what, 95, Lowell? 95, died about a year ago out of Westminster. Nelson was something else. Two of the leading educators of the day were the president of Harvard, James Conant, and the chancellor at Chicago. Both predicted disaster. You're going to let these veterans back in school, you can't control them, they won't do well, and you will ruin higher education in this country. Now, can you imagine anyone that smart being so far wrong about a change in public policy that gave the veterans a chance to go to college? Helen and I enrolled in the fall of 47. About 70% of our classmates were veterans. Check came the what, second day of every month, Hoy?
$65.
Huh? $65?
I think so.
Yeah. You look for it.
I still waiting for it.
You look for it. They were children out of the Depression. Had done without, things their siblings do without, things their neighbors do without. They were acutely aware they had been endowed with something terribly important. And they were determined to make the most of their opportunities. Prices were a bit different. University fees, $110 a year. $310 if you lived out of state. Shows at the music hall were $1.20. And we had the best. Bob Hope, Togie Carmichael, Fred Waring, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, Bob Burns. $2.50 would get you a filet at the old Wabash Hotel across town. $2,000 would buy a new car. $1,581 would get you a train ticket to Cleveland. And $75 would fly you to California. 40% of the students had a car. Traffic was horrible. And getting around was a chore. We had gone through a period where they didn't make new cars. They began to come back on the market, and veterans had a preference. If you're a veteran, you could go to the top of the list. There's a lot of veterans with new cars around over the campus. Now, can you imagine this one? There was no stoplight at State and University Street. University Street was two-way. There was no stoplight at Grant and Northwestern. Now, the guys like to drive to class. We had one fraternity brother who came to Purdue with a 4-holder Buick. Had a little age on it, but the car of choice at that time was a Buick Roadmaster. Had 4 holes in the vent holes in the fender. I am sure he had been admonished that if he put a scratch on that car, he'd lose his wheels. He'd drive up to State Street from the university and couldn't get into the traffic. He'd sit there and sit there and sit there. And the guys were late getting to class. Until one morning, one of their brothers, took him by the bumper and pushed that car out in the middle of traffic. It was kind of scary. Either Northwestern and Grant or State and University. A lot of males on campus. The ratio was 5.5 to 1. You didn't have many dates. The library was always there, but not nearly as much fun. As I recall, there were down here three girls in the high school at that period of time. Well, some things have changed. Some remain the same. Slide rules are gone. Computers are here. Triple X is still here. Harry is still here. They're gone. The Smokestack, Blue Blazer, Linwood, Tips, and the then grocery of choice, the Piggly Wiggly. Well, how was it? How did we love Purdue? Well, let me count the ways. But primarily with tolerance and goodwill. Consider space was a premium. One had to have a verifiable local address to be admitted. If you lived in town and had a basement, you had students. Students doubled up. Some places there were 3 where one should have been. Temporary housing and temporary classrooms were everywhere. Army barracks, Quonset huts, warehouses were moved to campus from nearby Army bases. National homes created a low-cost small city out near the airport for faculty and graduate students. And one of the workmen helping out there was a man by the name of Arthur Hansen. He became Purdue's president in 1971. There were 3 permanent women's residence halls at that time. One that they built in 34 and 2 more. And they brought in Army barracks also for women's housing. The university had given preference to the GIs and the upper third of the graduating class. They became creative. The top floor of the Ag Engineering building became a dormitory. It was cold and drafty and uncomfortable. But it housed veterans. And the person for whom this building was named after went in one night to check to see how things were. Dave Finner believed that everyone should play by the rules. And there sat a student at his desk with a 5th of whiskey, studying. Which is really against her. Could have been expelled for it. Dave ignored it. And he and his friend got outside, and the other professor said, "Dave, you didn't say a thing to that boy about his booze." And Dave's response was, "If I had to live in that damn place, I need a stiff drink now and then myself." Well, students are older, they're more mature, there's a limited nonsense. However, if they knocked on your door at 10:30 and said beer call, it was best to go. There was a lot of camaraderie between the students and the professors. I hope that's still the case here. Classes began at 7, went until the evening, noon on Saturday. They were crowded, professors overworked, and there was inconvenience. However, we did not complain about what we did not have. The war was over. They were home and getting their lives together. How did veterans do? I once asked Nelson Parkhurst if he had records of veterans retention. He had none. What he did say, they did all right. Some struggled, but they got through it. The education editor of the New York Times wrote in November of '47 was, GIs are hogging the honor roll, what he said, and the dean's list. They're walking away with the top marks in their courses. Far from being an educational problem, he had become an asset to higher education. Did everything go as it should? Probably not. Probably had some didn't quite measure up either in the classroom, or students didn't, sometimes might not have measured up. I can think of two incidents. I had an English 1 instructor who was a halfway decent teacher. But at that time, he had the series honorary. He had an essay contest for the freshmen in the School of Agriculture. I had written an essay. I'd like to have him critique it, and I told him. You know what his response was? I simply don't have time. So I went to the recitation building that housed the English department, wandered up and down the hallway until I found an open door with a professor at his desk. Went in and told him what I'd like to have. He said, sure, sit down. Spent 40 minutes with me. I wasn't his student. And afterwards I got to thinking about, you know, the department head should know about this. So I sat down and wrote the department, had a letter, told me about my experience. And I don't know whether I had any influence on the department head or not. Next fall, that one instructor wasn't here. But he didn't have time for his student. The other one I'd call your attention to, a friend of ours had a horrible time with English 32, and I don't know what it is today. English composition course. At that time, you had to pass English 32 to graduate. And here's this ag student who could tell you anything about animal production that you'd want to know, chapter and verse, who had not yet passed English 32. Last semester, he had to have it. And late in the semester, we had to try and work this out. And it's one of my early lessons in management. We found out he was an English instructor, liked girls, he was single, he liked to sing, he liked to play the piano, he liked to drink. So we invited him to chaperone a trade party at one of the sororities up at Lake Shaver. My job was to keep his glass full of booze. No wonder I hadn't killed him. But we started at noon. At midnight, he was still playing the piano and singing at the time of his life. And our friend passed English 32. I don't know whether it had an influence or not, but it didn't hurt. Well, as you look back on the GI Bill, the $5.5 billion that were spent, what did we get? We got 450,000 engineers. We got 240,000 accountants. 238,000 teachers. 67,000 medical doctors. 22,000 dentists. And scores of other people who went into business or some other form of professional or business service. We went from pre-war percentage of kids going on to college of 15 to where somewhere near 60% today go to some sort of post-secondary education. When the GIs finished college, they wanted their kids to go into college. And then their grandkids go into college. And most of those grandkids are now have their college degrees. The 1944 Act has provided a tremendous potential in this country for greater lifetime earnings, increased productivity, and a higher standard of living for all of us. Greeley said, education is a great social and economic equalizer in this country. Perhaps it's best described by a friend of ours by the name of Parlberg, who wrote a poem about Purdue. When he said that Purdue, maybe it was more of an idea than what it was grounds and buildings. This is what Don Parlberg said. Purdue is not so much a place as it is an idea. And here's the meat of it. The idea is that knowledge is a common good, not to be preempted by the few, but to be made available to all, including those who lack both wealth and social status. To some, Purdue is but a place with grounds and trees and buildings. To some, Purdue is sports with teams that win or lose. To me, Purdue is a great idea that always wins. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming. It's been fun.